Hello, I'm John Powell. In this segment of our oral history series, we're talking with Peggy Rosenzweig, who was both a member of the State Assembly and the State Senate, a Republican from Wauwatosa. And thank you very much for joining us with this. In the State Assembly from 1982 to 1993, won a special election for the State Senate at that point and served until 2002. So thanks for joining us. And I have to start out by asking, Peggy, is that a nickname?
No. Well, actually, yes. So yes and no. My name when I was born was Margaret Ann, and nobody ever called me Margaret. And so I was called Peggy from the very first. When I ran for election, we still had a law that said that you had to put your legal name on the ballot. Since nobody knew me as Margaret, I needed to be Peggy, and so I went to court and actually changed my name, and it is Peggy Ann Rosenzweig. Although subsequently, Peggy Krusek did have the law changed so she could be Peggy.
Oh, so that you could get one that was not your legal name.
That's correct. You can use a nickname now.
Do you think that helped, having a nickname rather than Margaret Ann or something?
Well, of course, because nobody had ever, they would not have known me. I would have campaigned and they knew me as Peggy, and all of a sudden there would be a strange Margaret on the
But
ballot.
aside from recognition, you think it's better to have a nickname like Peggy? Or?
Oh gosh, I guess that's
say,
fundamental. I don't know.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background, where you started out and how you got involved in politics.
Okay, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I was born in a family that was quite political, although in those days women were not promoted, pushed to go into politics or to the legal profession, and so I became a dance major, and that's what I thought I would do. And then I got married on the way and had 5 kids, went back to school, and I wasn't going to be a dancer anymore. Excuse me. So I, in fact, got into my first love. By that time, women were in politics and went to political science.
So growing up, did you hear a lot of politics?
Yeah, I certainly did. I certainly did. We had a very lively debate in our living room on Sundays. And I came from Detroit and an interesting background. Part of the family was Democrat, part of it was Republican, and they had some interesting clashes.
How did those go? Did you participate as a child?
No, I listened. It was too ferocious. I mean, they would really go at it. I mean, yeah, it was lively debate.
And how did you happen to select the Republican side?
Well, I selected it. Never belonged to a party prior to that, but I selected it because everybody I knew in Wauwatosa was Republican. And frankly, the gentleman who represented that area was far to the right of my beliefs and of most of the people that I knew's beliefs. And people really wanted a more moderate voice for Wauwatosa. And so I felt if I was going to take the step of running, that that would be the way to do it.
So you were urged to run?
Yes, I was. Yes.
By an organized group or friends? Or?
No, I think we joked that it was the Tosa Nostra, but I think what happened is I went to the medical school and worked there for a while, the medical center, and got involved in local politics. And people saw that I had an interest in it, and they were looking for somebody to take on the task and thought I'd be good at it.
Did you run for office prior to running for the Assembly?
Never, except I think I was president of the PTA.
So how did you get involved in politics? What sorts of things did you do prior to the Assembly?
Well, actually I did some lobbying on behalf of the medical center with the county board and the city in order to get rather benign kinds of projects moves through, like a daycare center or a parking lot or things that they needed out there at the medical school and the medical center. And that was my introduction to it.
Now, is that what's now the medical college?
Well, the medical college sits on the medical center, and it's on the county grounds of Milwaukee. So it is all of those jurisdictions, part county, part city, and part private public.
So you lobbied basically the city and the county?
That's correct.
Successfully?
And yes, actually I did. I'm happy to say.
You got those parking lots and
So
daycare
the
centers
daycare
and things?
center, that's right. I think they all survive to this very day.
So politics really is, all politics is local?
You bet. My husband tells the story that he wondered when I was running for state assembly why I wasn't running for something important. And I asked
Like
what that
county
was,
board?
and he said, well, you know, they're going to curtail our garbage collection. And he said, you know, if you ran for the Common Council, you could be helpful in that area.
So that's what people care about first.
I think so, you bet.
What was your first campaign like?
Oh, I remember it quite fondly. It was the hardest thing I ever did, probably, because I didn't know anything about running a campaign. But I did know that I wanted to prevail. And there was a lot of interest in me prevailing, from both sides of the aisle, I think, frankly. And so I did some research, and I went to people that knew a lot about running primary campaigns. And I learned about going door to door, how to do follow-up, how to organize, and so I got a cadre of people in the community to help me organize that. And I must say, a variety of them came from my life in the neighborhood or my life working on the ballet or the opera or you know, PTA, things that I had done, and largely women.
So you'd been basically a volunteer mom?
Yeah,
with all
exactly.
Of these, with the ballet and the opera and
Yes,
the PTA,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
You must have been, with 5 kids, you must have been pretty darn busy.
I was. But going back to school energized me, and getting my first part-time job, it was all very exciting. And certainly to come to Madison was the classic, I guess Mrs. Smith goes to Madison. It was, I really didn't know very much about what I was getting into. Learned quickly.
Where did you went back to school, you say? Where was that and when?
At UWM.
And when was that?
Actually, I started school in about 1976, I guess.
Well, now, you've had a degree from Stevens Point.
No,
No?
I never went to Stevens Point. I
Oh.
don't know.
That was in the Blue Book, I think.
I don't think so.
No?
Okay.
Sorry.
I went.
So you went to UWM.
Yeah, I had started school when I was 17 at Michigan State for a short period of time, moved to Wayne State and in Detroit, because I think I had a boyfriend there or something. And then I went off to Juilliard for a year to study dance, and I came back and married somebody that was from Detroit.
And what did you take at UWM?
Political science. And international relations at that point, but I figured that I probably couldn't go off and do that with 5 kids and a husband at home. So took on Plan B.
So you had a primary election. At that time, was there going to be a Democrat, or was the primary the whole thing?
Yeah, there was a Democrat, and he had run in several areas before. He, I believe, was an assistant DA in Milwaukee County, and he ran a hefty campaign against me, but frankly I had a lot of momentum coming into that general election, and as I mentioned, Wauwatosa was at that time, it's not currently, but was very, very skewed Republican.
So Did the candidate you defeated, did he have a lot of support, or had he alienated people, or what?
It turned out that he didn't have as much, he might have been a bit of a paper tiger. He didn't have as much support. He certainly never came back after that. His name was George Glicka, I might as well say it out loud. So he was gone. And certainly the support, which was with the local Republican club, was not a particular popular group at that time. So,
what were the issues you ran on?
Oh, I think about that a lot now because some of them still kind of fester when we talk about it. The death penalty was a big thing because my opponent's only bill that I could figure he introduced on a every 2 years was instituting the death penalty. And he was big on that. And so that became a real pivotal issue in the campaign. And of course, we still, argue about that. Certainly debated it in the legislature when I was there, too. I was very much against it, and he was very much for it. So that defined us in a way. Certainly local issues. He had been an incumbent for 16 years and spent most of his time in Madison. And he didn't have a really very good reputation.
Did you go door to door, or what was your method?
Went to 15,000 doors that summer.
Wow.
Lost about 20 pounds. And I was very disciplined, to say the least. My husband would say driven.
Driven, yes. Did you, was that a proper word to use? Do you need to be driven to get elected to office?
Well, you've heard the expression fire in the belly. I think you do have to have fire in the belly. In a contested race. Yes.
Now that's many hours a day.
Yes, it was.
Were your kids still at home?
Well, 3 of them were older. 2 of them, one of them in high school, and the younger one in middle school. Excuse me, I can't get rid of it, but anyhow, we had, supports in the neighborhood and so on. So.
How much did you spend?
$25,000, which was a groundbreaking on summer.
That was a lot for that time.
You bet it was, and I think $2,000 of it was my own money, and I raised it, which was pretty good.
Yeah. Who did you raise it from? Was it small donations? Or?
Small donations at first, certainly, but they were friends and family and so on. But then the word got out that there was somebody who was really working hard and was working against this chap that people didn't find so savory. So then it started to come in from larger groups.
Were you able to do advertising with that much in the big Milwaukee market?
Gosh, I think the Wauwatosa News Times was as big as we got.
Well, that's right. It's, once again, local, not really Milwaukee. So you won? Did you win big?
Yeah. I believe I won with 58% of the vote.
That's pretty good. And then you were re-elected 3 more times.
That's correct.
It's
4 more times.
You served 10 years.
That's correct.
What were the big issues during your time in the Assembly, which was basically the 80s?
Oh, gosh. Well, if you remember, Governor Earl was in, and there were some big issues that I think, and given that I was a Republican at that point, we were just kind of concerned about these were bad economic times, and so I think I got on the Economic Development Committee, and we went around the state and we're looking at ways in which we could enhance the economy. So some things never change. Of course, the Republicans were against. My first vote, I think, was on increasing the sales tax.
You were in on the first vote there, the first bill that Governor Earl signed to make
That's
the
right.
5% sales tax permanent, $1 billion tax increase.
That's right.
And you voted,
against it.
but you were in the minority at the time.
That's correct, by a long shot.
Uh,
I think we had 42 members at that point.
But when you left, the Republicans had gained quite a few. Had they gained
That's
the majority?
correct.
Though?
No, they gained it in '94.
In '94. And that's when you went to the Senate.
That's right.
So when you were elected to the Senate in the special election of '73,
It was pivotal because I then was part of the majority.
you were the 17th
That's
Republican.
right.
You gave them the majority.
That's correct.
So that was a new experience for you.
It was indeed.
What's the difference between the majority and the minority?
Well, I'm going to file a minority report on this, and it's probably the only person that you're ever going to talk to. But in many ways, I enjoyed being in the minority because many of the issues, and for instance, healthcare, were more akin to the majority party. And so as
Your own views, you mean?
My own views. And of course, I represented an area that had many institutions in it, healthcare institutions. And so my own views were certainly those of my constituents too, and I was able to work with the other side of the aisle to promote those things that I cared about. And I think, you know, to anticipating maybe one of your questions, what was something that I was terribly proud of. And aside from the kinds of things I did on mental health issues, which we were able to move along and actually pass some of them, the kind of advanced directives that we have now in this state were a direct result of my work. Many times with Tom Barrett now, who's the mayor, but we did the living will and we did the durable power of attorney. And it turned out that I was the author on durable power of attorney because Tom had been elected to the Senate in a special election.
So they let a Republican be the lead author.
That's correct. Just was one of those.
That doesn't happen anymore, I understand.
I understand, yeah, I understand that that's true. But, you know, those were kind of interesting times. And I served on the Board of Regents with Tom Loftus, and we were kind of talking about that. He was, of course, Speaker at the time, and the kinds of differences and so on. But it is, it's perhaps a different world now.
Now, 1993 was a pivotal year, the year that the Republicans gained control of the U.S. Congress. That was quite a revolutionary.
Yeah, it was at 93 and then
so
94.
Your election was in the spring, but that fall, Republicans won the Congress.
Right.
So that was kind of a watershed year. Why?
What do I think was going
change?
on? Well, I think back on it, and it may have been the healthcare issue that prompted it, although there were other things going on, I'm sure. Things became much more polarized in both places, and I think that occurred because as you get closer in numbers in a house, people get really skittish about losing the majority. And then people in the minority get really antsy to get the majority. So it's...
Had the senator retired, resigned? Is that why there was a special election?
In my case, Tom Barrett was elected to the Congress.
Ah, right, in 93.
That's correct.
And that was the special election to replace?
It was to replace, what's this gentleman's?
Is it Blackie or Royce or?
Royce.
Henry Royce had resigned.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so then you're suddenly in the majority
That's
in 94. And what's the difference between the Senate and the Assembly?
Oh, I think it's a closer body, and it's probably, at least theoretically, much more collegial. But it didn't, because of just exactly the phenomenon that we're talking about, the closeness in the political parties to each other, that if you have 16, 17, you're always kind of pushing against each other. And I think that there was a great deal of resentment that the Republicans had taken over. And it's hard to go from the majority to the minority. And the majority had been there for 30 years. And now they found themselves without power. And it gets you off your kilter. If you had never known the majority, it wouldn't make any difference.
Others have said that the assembly is less organized, more raucous, perhaps?
Yeah, but I kind of liked it.
Are those accurate words? Are those?
Yeah, you bet. You bet. It was more tumble-turvy, whatever. But no, I did like those days very much. And I still see people on both sides of the aisle from those days. And you can actually tell when you see them that people remember it very, very fondly.
So there were friendships across the aisle at that time?
Oh, yeah. And this is a very strange thing, but I would put it down to the ethics issue. That when people stopped going to those funny receptions, do you remember that people used to come from out of town? The bankers.
Yeah, all of the interest groups, profits and nonprofits.
That's right. Would all come, and then they'd have these receptions. And everybody was invited, and you would go over there, and because there was no cost. And you kind of kibitz with your colleagues, and you'd kibitz with your constituents. That was all really lovely. But you wouldn't eat anything because you couldn't face another cold hot dog or funny meatball, so you'd make plans to go out for dinner afterwards.
Okay, sometimes with your colleagues.
That's correct.
So the ethics laws came in, and that was taking something of value.
That's right. So you
from
couldn't
groups
do
that
that.
have lobbyists. So
That's right.
do
So
that.
you'd have to pay $10 to go across the street to in a park, excuse me, but to have a cold meatball or hot dog, and you on the salary we got, we weren't going to do that. So we never went anymore, and people stopped kind of seeing each other in a very social setting.
So that was a social good for the legislature, you think?
In a strange way, and I probably, again, would be the only person that would tell you that.
So you weren't influenced by those terrible lobbyists. You are one now, I understand.
That's
so
right.
I
I'd like to think of myself as a good one, but
Well, let's talk about one of the issues which was big in 1993 and 94. The
Yes.
Clintons were working on it, and you were, healthcare.
That's right.
And talk about deja vu as we record this. Here it's the huge issue. So what
Yeah.
was going on in 93?
Well, if you remember, Governor Thompson was our governor, and he had a real passion for healthcare reform. And Joe Leon, he picked to be his, after a while, his secretary. He decided to introduce a healthcare reform bill. And it was an omnibus one. He was really going to change the way in which healthcare was delivered was presented in Wisconsin, or delivered in Wisconsin. And I had been interested in healthcare. My district certainly was interested in healthcare. And when I was elected to the Senate, they thought that promoting me in a special place would be a good thing to do. So they made me chair of the Healthcare Reform Committee. Well, what I learned is that Tommy's bill, the governor's bill, was very much akin to Hillary's bill, except that it wasn't mandatory. It was voluntary. And it was very far-reaching. And so you would take it to places in the state where we thought it would be a good idea to get feedback from the public, and you would find that everybody had a stake in how their health care was delivered, which wasn't surprising. But number two, they all wanted health care reform, but they didn't want to change what they were doing. And some of them really got scared and really pushed back a lot in organized groups. And let me tell you a little bit about that, because that's kind of interesting in light of what we're facing today. So the guy who sells, or gal who sells insurance down the street, healthcare insurance, he or she may not get the same kind of margin of commission under a new plan. So they felt their livelihood was in jeopardy. The pharmacist that was actually a good friend of mine, had a couple of pharmacies in Wauwatosa. He was afraid that his reimbursement that he was getting from insurers would be changed, and therefore his profitability would go away. And you know, he's a small business owner. I think even the dietitian who lives across the street came up and talked about, well, under the plan, it doesn't appear that specifically dietitians would be paid under our current system in the same way. So while everybody was well-meaning in really wanting it, they were unclear whether or not this was going to be good for them personally or bad. And I think that you're seeing that play out again. So it's true that large interest groups play a big role in pushing back on government when we try to change things. But citizens, well-meaning citizens, also are frightened for one reason or another. And some of them for no good reason. And some of them, you know, you have to think, well, you know, things will change a little bit. We believe they're going to be better, but it may not.
Were people frightened? I mean, we had at the national level the ads against
That's right. Well,
and
certainly that wasn't helpful. So we actually pulled the plug on the bill after a while.
So you didn't really pass anything?
We passed it out of committee, but
Yeah.
a version of it, but it didn't go much farther than that.
What specifically would it have done? I mean,
It would have made little buying areas, 5 of them throughout the state. And
established essentially buying cooperatives.
cooperatives, correct.
Is that cooperatives as they're talking about now?
No, I don't think so.
Pools, I think.
Pools,
you would
yeah.
create a pool
That's right.
that would be run by the government, but or not.
A voluntary kind of group of people that would convene. But you're right, under the auspices of.
And an individual could join, or a small business could join.
That's correct.
And that was shot down.
Well, it would alter certainly the way in which our system is currently handled.
Well, you were in the Senate for another 10 years beyond that. Was there any more to do with health care?
Yeah, certainly Badger Care came along. I went on joint finance after that. We were in the majority at that time. And the governor, again in another bold move, introduced welfare reform. And welfare reform had a component of providing health care for the working poor.
This was Tommy Thompson's Wisconsin Works Plan, the welfare
That's right.
reform. Yeah.
Right.
And so health care had to be part of that.
That's right. But the initial health care plan that he proposed, we kind of found wanting. We went back to the drawing board, and out of that was born Badger Care, the initial Badger Care.
Which is still going as we speak.
Oh, that's right. And
Governor
it's
Doyle
enhanced.
expanded it, I believe.
That's certainly, he's
And
expanded
how does
it
that
twice.
work?
People that have above the income for Medicaid are able to buy into the health care plan to Medicaid through a sliding scale, and it provides up to, I think, maybe it's 150% of poverty now, are able to get a Medicaid plan in a sliding scale of payment. And it's a combination under Medicaid of federal and state dollars, and it's provided through a waiver system.
The state had to get a waiver from the federal government to allow this to be done.
That's correct.
That was not easy, as I remember.
That's right, and it required a lot of bipartisan work at that point, and we had a good coalition of people that were really interested in it and worked together very hard.
Do you think Badger Care has been successful?
I do. I'm not in a position now to do the evaluations, but from what I gather, it has served the public well.
Wisconsin has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, percentage of uninsured in the country, I believe, among the states. Is that part of the reason, Badger Care?
Well, I think traditionally we've always had a low percentage of people without insurance relative to the rest of the country. But this certainly has contributed to the stability of those numbers, I think.
What advice would you have to the people arguing and debating and struggling over health care today?
I have to tell you, I'm just glad I'm not there doing it. It is a very difficult task, and I think my heart goes out to the president, because I think it's difficult.
Well, now, you've been involved in this for so long. Your husband's a doctor. You worked for the medical
center. My father was a physician, too.
Father was a physician. If you had your druthers, if you could write the bill and pass it, what would you do right now at the federal level?
I have to tell you. Oh, yeah. I think certainly it's not perfect, but I would pass something in order to get the debate going. I mean, or to get the process going. I think to be paralyzed in the position that we're in now is not good for the country. And so I would hope that something comes out of this. The particulars certainly, are debatable. And a lot of people would like a single payer. A lot of people would like the public option. All of them could work.
But you would vote
I wouldn't go to the cross. I wouldn't go to the cross on a particular.
So you think that if anything significant passes, that's good?
I believe that.
Because that can be built upon?
That's correct.
It looks at the moment as if some of the folks who supported President Obama are going to be sadly disappointed and perhaps angry. I mean, some of them are already angry that apparently he's not pushing the public option or single payer or what so many people
And that,
want.
by the way, happened under Badger Care. And one of my favorite Democratic gurus said to me, and he's quite liberal, he said to me, we can't let, the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I guess I would say to them, keep your powder dry. There'll be another day, but to get progress is better than nothing.
If very little is done, it might be that the Democrats and President Obama lose a lot of their constituency, possibly the Republicans winning the next election. I mean, they have to be weighing all this sort of thing. What would you put the odds at anything significantly coming out right now?
Oh, well, I can tell you my husband's are more pessimistic than mine. He says 60-40.
Against or for?
Against. But he's said that since the beginning. Not that he wants it thus, but that's what he thinks. I would reverse it. I would do the reversal. I think 64 and maybe 40 against.
Because are enough people beginning to realize it? Almost everybody says the current system or non-system is broken.
That's correct.
And I assume you agree with that.
That's right.
But how to fix it, everybody is worried about
great idea.
how it affects themselves.
That's correct.
That's what it boils down to.
That's right. And it was an echo of 93.
And there's so many competing interests, as you say, the insurance salesperson
right.
and the insurance company and the doctor and the hospital and the clinic and
That's right.
everybody.
Although I will say this for President Obama and his people, they have certainly been able to dissipate some of the large interest groups and to kind of even things out a little bit. So,
Are you surprised at the vehemence and the apparent misstatements, death panels and that sort of thing? Are you surprised at that?
yes, and no. Toward the end of my tenure, and certainly since then, I've noticed an increasing amount of anger in the public, and it's driven, I believe, largely on some of our communications, enhanced communications, in this era that we live in. And I know that you maybe don't even want to hear this, but part of it is driven by talk radio, and part of it is driven by the internet. And it gets in people's minds, I think, in a way that going to their door or ringing them on the telephone or meeting them at a public forum without that gets at them. And so it feeds into dissatisfaction and fears and all kinds of things that are going on in their world. And both sides, by the way, are guilty of it. I mean, I occasionally have been interested in turning on to hear what they're saying about me or people I care about or whatever, and I hear it and I just kind of in wonderment. Actually, the New York Times did an article Sunday a little bit on this, on that phenomenon. So it's not just my observation.
Many have observed that we're seemingly fragmented, and now everybody can find their own information. You learn where to look for the information
That's
that
right.
backs up your own opinion.
Craziness, yes.
How crazy it is, or whatever your opinion might
Yeah.
be. And so people do that. They seek it out. Their view is reinforced, and we're moving farther apart. Is that?
Yes. Also, you can gin up anger. My word, and I don't know whether that's a real word, but it seems like you can grow that anger. So you get the fear, and then you build on it. You continue to build on it. It gets at people's basic fears. And there are, I suppose, hot buttons for people who are dissatisfied with their lot in life, or maybe out of a job, or who knows, fearful about their religious beliefs, or
Race?
Race.
You think that's part of the
Well,
anger against Obama?
I don't believe so, but I mean, I think it's certainly an aspect, and wouldn't dispel that those issues will be with us. But again, I would read Frank Rich in the New York Times this week, and he talks a little bit about what is driving it. Part of it is the partisanship. I mean, Republicans want to get back in power, so they would use anything. So they would divide. But then you get people who have religious beliefs or conspiratorial beliefs.
Back in 1980, let's say, would opinion leaders, if not Republican leaders, be saying we want the administration to fail? Come right out and say that and work for that?
I was trying to fish back on that the other night, and I didn't think so. And then I heard a commentator talk about, well, when Franklin Roosevelt was a president and in the 30s made dramatic changes, was very popular. Father Coughlin in Detroit emerged, and he was a very vicious man who was an anti-Semite, and he really drove people on the right. So something emerged there. He talked a little bit about the rise of McCarthyism under under Truman, and how the right, and I won't say Republicans because it is the right. I mean, it's a very, we used to call them reactionary.
That's right. I hadn't heard that term
Yes,
for quite a while now that you mention
I'm really
it.
digging it up. Group of people that always believe in some kind of conspiracy, scapegoating. So that the McCarthy era came, then we have a repeat of it every time there's a president who's a more, less conservative or, you know, more liberal thinking, where change is going to happen, appears to be happening.
So extreme partisanship is not new.
I guess not. You know, I had to think about that for a while, but I think that I buy into at least part of that. Now, does race enter into this one and make it more, have a greater sense of urgency? I don't know. I mean, the 40s and 50s were very frightening times to live through. And we can all remember, and those of us who were here.
And the 30s too. You were a child, but do you recall the vitriol against Roosevelt?
I was too much of a child then to know, but certainly I remember when I was growing up in Detroit that we used to pass that church that Father Coughlin participated, or he was the pastor. And I mean, people would talk about it, and it was in such frightening tones that I knew it must have been very, very terrible at that time.
People would talk about it for or against, or?
Against, obviously. I'm born a Jew, and my parents, of course, and grandparents. It was, you know, it was a very frightening thing to have in your midst.
And in the 40s and 50s, as you say, McCarthyism. What are your reminiscences of?
Wow, I mean, I can remember in high school wanting to stay home just to watch the hearings because they were so...
The Army McCarthy hearings.
That's correct.
That would have been 53?
52, 53, 51 maybe.
Did you watch them?
Yeah, I did. Came home from school just to watch them.
What did you think?
I was scared to death. It was very angry. And of course, I told you we had this very political family, so the discussion about what would happen and what would happen to certain people.
Was your family involved in pro or con? There was the big
I had
Joe
an
Must
aunt.
Go campaign in Wisconsin to try to get him recalled. And
See, that I did not live here then, so I wouldn't have known about that. But I had an aunt who was very active in politics, and she did speech writing and so on for he ran as a senator from, and I think he prevailed. I'm trying to think of his name, but anyhow, Patrick. From Michigan, yeah. And so she was very active and talked about all the people that...
Who was your role model growing up or in politics?
Well, I think in many ways her husband. She was married to a very, he was very active in the union and was an executive secretary of one of the unions. And I admired him very much. He was very soft-spoken, unlike her, and thoughtful.
So you were a Republican by accident when you finally ran?
Yeah, I could have been a Democrat, could have been a Republican. I was just interested in politics.
You were a middle-of-the-roader.
And then I ended up in the middle of the road, and if you want to know today, I still am. I think in many ways that's a distraction from actually being a professional politician these days, because you know, moderates are not too much in demand.
That's what I know the leftists say, that you stand in the middle of the road, you're likely to get run over.
That's right.
And some would say you were.
That's right.
In 2002.
I was, indeed.
Defeated in the primary by a man who was certainly much farther to the right than you.
Yes.
What happened there?
Well, I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to run that time. I felt that my family was moving into different parts of the country, and I wanted to be able to see them. My sister and brother at that point were still alive. They were ailing in California. I wanted to be there. And I think I was prevailed upon that, this would be a race I should enter into, that redistricting was going to occur, and I'd have a very safe and good district, and they needed me to participate still. But in fact, the day that we put nomination papers in, at 5 o'clock that evening, this chap did put his file in his papers.
Tom Reynolds was his name.
Yes, right.
He'd run for, but that was a complete surprise that he ran for this office.
Yes, we kind of always knew he was there, but it didn't appear that he had the wherewithal, the resources to actually mount a campaign.
Now, this was at a time when there was a wave of conservatism, or what? How did he manage to prevail?
Well, an interesting set of circumstances. Primaries are, if you just watch them, are interesting in Wisconsin in that you don't have to declare your party. You can vote in an open primary, they say. But of course, you can't vote for somebody for governor on one party and then for a senator on the other party. So at that point, Tom Barrett and Jim Doyle were running for governor. And Tom Barrett comes from my district. I had taken his position in the state senate. We were fairly good friends. We'd served in the assembly and then known each other over the years, and shared many of the same people who cared about us. People really wanted to vote for him for governor from his community, and they wanted to vote for me for re-election. But it seemed like I was an incumbent. I was relatively safe. And they could vote for Tom and then vote for me in the general. So you would see Barrett, Rosenzweig signs all over the place.
Oh, really?
Not for the same election, though.
You mean both names on the same sign?
No.
No, but two signs in the same yard.
Yeah, exactly.
But obviously they decided to vote in the governor
Well,
race.
yeah, it seemed like, a more important thing to do. And so it left a very small pool of people to vote in the Republican primary.
So primaries have low turnout to start with, so
That's
it's
right.
turnout that's the key.
And certainly Doyle and Barrett worked that district very hard. And also, Peter Bach's wife, your county exec here,
Kathleen Falk
was running.
for governor.
Right. And, she's a popular woman. So, but didn't go to Barrett, went to Kathleen.
So did you know before the actual vote that you were in trouble, or was that a surprise
I
as
had
well?
an inkling, yes.
So how had campaigning changed from 1980 to 2002?
Well, in '93, it had changed somewhat when I ran for the Senate from 2002. I mean, 1982, rather. In that people were not as willing to open the door
When you went door to door?
when you went door to door, and that you had to look for other ways to approach them. And secondly, that in those days, in '82, a great many women were home still. By '93, that was largely not the case. So you wouldn't find people there during the day. And that special election occurred in the wintertime. So you had to think about ways in which you could approach people inside. And one of them was to use the telephone. And in those days, people still answered their telephone. So
And
that
you didn't have a zillion automated calls?
no, no. I mean, I would do, after it turned dark, and it was terribly cold at that point, too, I would get on the phones and
You
spend.
personally called?
That's correct. And so people were really impressed with it. And then we did, of course, much more campaigning by mail. So mail became a big deal. It was very costly, and it was pretty sophisticated, spiffy, if you will.
You had specialized mailing lists.
That's correct. You use specialized mailing list, and all of that was becoming more automated. Take a leap then to 2002, and people were really on the internet at that point. That became much more of a way of reaching folks. I was not terribly familiar nor agile with that. When I became familiar, wasn't very agile at it, which may not be a surprise to anybody because of my age, but so that was a challenge. For instance, you talked a little bit about money, and money became much more of a factor because advertising became a really big factor, as well as these very sophisticated, slick mailers.
You had
now,
to pay for the mailing lists, is that?
Well, just the cost of mailing, too, became very difficult. And those infamous robocalls became a factor, too. So certainly we were beginning to see then a really change in the dynamics, the way in which people receive their information. We touched a little bit about that earlier.
So you spent $25,000, which was an awful lot for
Princely sum.
for an assembly race in 1982. 1993, how much did you spend for the Senate?
$250,000.
$250,000, and in 2002?
I didn't spend very much.
Oh, I see.
I spent, for me, quite a bit, but I remembered it was a very short period of time from July 11th, I believe, until...
When you realized you had an opponent, yeah.
That's right. So, no, I didn't spend a lot. I didn't do any television advertising, which I had done in '93. And
That's very expensive, and Milwaukee's a big enough market.
Yeah, that's true.
And they say on television that you have to have a big package of spots or you won't break through
That's
the corner.
right.
So
That's
you had to buy
right.
a lot of time?
Time, especially as it got near to the time. But remember, that was a special election, so it would be more costly to buy it when you were in a competitive election, either for a primary or for a general.
Any ideas on how we might de-escalate from the big money and the high-pressure campaign?
Well, I think I'd have to leave that to the courts. So, because I think that's really a great factor in how it would require things that probably can't happen under current law or current interpretation of the law. In terms of campaign financing and the way in which we might want to curtail it by putting caps or other kinds of things, I'm remembering I sat on joint finance at a time when I think it was Brian Burke was there, and he was working across the aisle with Mary Panzer on a campaign finance issue, and I can remember seeing the unions, the right to life, and I forget the third one, but there was a troika of very important interest groups. I think the teachers union actually was a part of that.
And WMC?
They weren't in that picture. I have a frame in my mind of 3 of them sitting over there. Very cast of well-known characters, so you probably know. with their arms around each other, locked in concert.
And all opponents of
Of
limiting campaign finance.
yes, correct.
Think there's any chance for that? Or would you be in favor of it if you could?
Well, I suppose I would if I could, but you know, I guess until the courts decide what is allowable, it may be a fool's errand at this point. And I just would go one step farther. We may even come beyond that. If you think about, again, how people are receiving their information more and more. They're receiving it through the internet, talk radio, other kinds of ways that activate people.
I think you were saying that, especially the first time you ran, face-to-face communication is the best way, and you went door to door. Is there any of that left? Is it possible? You say people aren't home during the day, they won't answer their doors in the evening. Is it possible to have the sort of personal communication at the state level?
With difficulty. I mean, people go to events, so certainly being at events is helpful. Going to fish fries in Milwaukee is always a good thing to do, and local church picnics and you know, that kind of activity. I don't think, I mean, you still see occasionally somebody going door to door, but it's not as prevalent.
Now, you said a while back that Republican and right, political right, are not necessarily the same thing.
Not necessarily.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that at least there used to be a core of Republicans, you know, and I still see them in the Capitol, that are fairly moderate folks, come from communities and that are slightly more conservative, and they reflect that perspective. Some of them I served with, you know, that are, I would say, moderate. Then you've got what I ventured to say was the reactionary, which would be, in my view, against most everything that government does.
Simply anti-government.
That's correct.
I was going to bring up that you were not the only one defeated by a candidate from the right.
That's correct.
I recall that there were 4 Republican women, generally regarded as moderates, who voted against the death penalty bill when that up and down vote happened 15 years ago, was it, or closer to 20?
It might be 15.
But anyway, Joanne Hilsman retired, was Waukesha was replaced by a very far to the right male. Then Barbara Lorman of Fort Atkinson,
Yes.
then you, and then Mary Panzer, all defeated in primaries by men far to their right. I think I'm
That's correct.
being accurate about that.
That's right.
Has the Republican Party just moved that far to the right, or?
Well, I saw a quote by Olympia Snow from up in Maine, and she pretty much said that she hadn't changed because somebody was accusing her or asked her whether she had become more moderate or what happened. And she just said, no, I've stayed the same. She believed that the party in general had been changed.
Do you think the Republican Party has to broaden its base? I mean, we used to hear about the big tent, but the big tent seems to have been going the other way. Does the party have to moderate to get a bigger tent, or?
Well, you know, it depends on who you talk to. I believe that that's true, but then when I had an interesting conversation with a former colleague of mine when they lost the assembly this time. And he said, oh no, I don't believe that. I believe that we weren't conservative enough, not consistently conservative or values-driven enough. And that's why people lost heart with us.
We hear values-driven. What would that mean to you? What do you consider the values that should drive?
Lord knows, but
I mean, you know, you can say
there's
it's,
a
God and guns, or.
Well, I mean, you know, to be honest, abortion continues to be a vexing issue for legislators to confront. Certainly it's a polarizing issue, it's a wedge issue. It continues to be one that I suppose, quote unquote, you would put in the category of this values-driven. I don't get it, but that's clearly, you know, one of the code, that's a code word for that. Guns, certainly, for whatever reason, I don't think that that is a value, but I mean, you could. At least it is that. I don't know. It's an interesting, what does it mean to you?
Well, during your time, many bills to restrict abortion came up.
That's
Did you
correct.
vote against them?
As I recall, I placed one vote against, no, for that side, and I was very upset with myself, and I did so because people had convinced me that was the party position, and I don't believe I ever did that again.
These bills did things like require a waiting period,
Right.
require certain consultation beforehand, and many different limitations,
Yeah.
many of which passed. Most of them passed, I believe, that came up within Roe versus Wade.
Yes,
And so you generally voted against them.
yeah, especially in the Senate, we had some pretty lively debates.
Do you think that contributed to your loss?
Well, certainly that was the issue that he took me up on. You know, this man was very possessed by that issue.
He only served one term.
That's correct.
And I believe I can say it without venturing an opinion, that he was very far to the right, to the
Very.
point that the Milwaukee talk show, AM talk radio people turned against him, and in fact were calling him a nutcase.
Right?
And he was defeated this last time around by a Democrat.
That's right. So they lost the seat initially. Anyhow.
But a Democrat from Wauwatosa?
Well, it's not Wauwatosa, which has changed some, but the demographics of that Senate seat have altered dramatically because it now takes in part of Waukesha County. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of it are in Waukesha County.
Is that due to reapportionment? Or?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Because when you see I was astounded to see some of it going way back. You know, Wauwatosa was Hard Rock Republican, and now Shorewood, Whitefish Bay, and even Wauwatosa are drifting Democratic.
That's correct. They're becoming much more urbanized, and so that would reflect just, again, changing demographics. I misspoke. It wouldn't. It's about half, I'm sorry, because West Allis still is in that district. But West Allis, for interesting reasons, is quite conservative.
Blue collar.
Blue collar,
And,
conservative.
sort of blue collar. Or we say blue dog Democrat. That's the the buzzword. As
But
we
they
record
can
this.
vote strongly Republican too. So it's just, but Elm Grove and Brookfield are very Republican.
Are there new issues? For example, climate change is a huge issue now.
Right.
When did that surface?
In 1982.
When you first went.
That's right.
Climate change was on the...
Well, if you remember, Tony Earl was very active in environmental issues.
He'd been the secretary of the DNR.
That's
Prior
correct.
to that, a member of the Assembly. We went to get him for one of these
Yeah.
programs.
Oh, he'd love to do it. Yes, and I would do that promptly if I were you. Gratuitous comment, but so he was very anxious to move that issue.
And did you see it as global warming or climate change? Were those words used in '82?
Climate change was and I kind of think global warming. There are people that are still remembering this in the Capitol, but it certainly has emerged again as a big issue.
We think of it perhaps as a relatively new issue, but apparently not.
Not in Wisconsin anyhow, which tends to be environmentally sensitive.
But nothing was done at the time, of course. Were there any specific bills introduced or anything along those lines? I mean, there were conservation
studies,
bills.
and I think that there were actually bills. Mary Lou Muntz may have introduced something. I don't know. Do you remember Mary Lou?
Oh, yeah, certainly. A Democrat from Madison.
Right.
There were certainly people who were environmentally conscious.
Yes, right.
But I don't recall specifically that global climate change was... At that time, there were people who still say we're heading into the next ice age.
Yeah. Well, don't you hear that in the wintertime still here?
Well, we could still find people who say that, I suppose. What other issues? You've mentioned, of course, health care, the issue that probably closest to you.
The economy, certainly, that was a very big issue and continued to be. Welfare was a big deal, and especially coming from Milwaukee County. So that I don't think you see that much of it, so, although child welfare is a big deal now.
Of course, the economy was in bad shape, especially for what was known as the Rust Belt, Wisconsin
That's
and
right.
other industrial states.
And you remember
in
that Governor
1982
Thompson ran on that issue.
to rebuild the economy.
The economy, that's correct.
And so Tony Earl, as we mentioned before, his first bill that he got to sign was a huge tax increase because the state was $2 billion in debt or something
That's
like
probably
that.
why Governor Dreyfus did not run again,
No.
if you think about it, because there was such a great deficit and he didn't care to participate in that at that point.
And I believe that was the last general tax rate increase of a general tax way back
Is
in
it really
83,
true?
I believe.
83.
I mean, there have been around the edges,
Just
lots
right.
of fee
tax,
increases
tax
and
tax reform.
increases, but an actual rate increase of a major tax,
Wow.
don't think we've had one.
Thank you for telling me that. I hadn't
Since-
thought
well,
about
I think,
that.
I think that's true. Check on that. But so since then, it seems politicians have been so leery of tax increases.
That's
that no matter
correct.
what you do, provide more services or whatever, but don't increase taxes.
Yeah, yeah.
And you heard that a lot, I suppose.
Oh, of course, of course.
I want my worthwhile program passed,
Oh, yeah.
but don't dare increase
Just-
my taxes, right?
Yeah, and then when you campaign on not raising their taxes, people get really upset and they say, but how are you going to lower my taxes?
Did you get that a lot?
That's correct. Sure, property taxes particularly, and you've certainly dealt with that over time.
Well, that's been the perennial in Wisconsin
That's
politics,
correct.
the property tax.
Because our property taxes are high in Wisconsin.
And this goes back more than 100 years now.
That's correct.
How to relieve property taxes.
Yeah.
Did you accomplish anything along those lines, or do you
Well,
think
if
we ever
you
will?
remember that there was, in 93, 94, a great move to take the schools off property taxes, which were seen as the real driver of the property tax costs. And that still is being hotly debated.
So that was that when the promise for the state to pay 2/3 of
That's
school costs
2/3
on average,
funding, correct.
which is still, well, it's been
Tinkered around.
finagled a little bit.
Right.
We're a little under 2/3
Yeah.
probably, but that seems untouchable.
That's right. It kind of came in, and people thought it was a good idea because it did relieve the taxpayer, at least initially. But in fact, the teachers felt that they were unfairly tarnished by it.
And that 2/3 guarantee, of course, has guaranteed increased state spending, big time,
That's right.
ever since.
That's right. And people wonder why. You know, I sat on the Board of Regents for a substantial amount of time, and people wondered why the university didn't get a greater share of the financing from the state. And what I tried to point out is that in the meantime, things have overtaken that share. And if you look at the pie share, Medicaid has grown tremendously, and I would argue rightfully so. We do provide generous benefits for low-income people in poverty. In healthcare, we do, our corrections side grew enormously, and then this educational segment grew. So what is left is, you know, for local governments, universities, and so on. And right or wrong, that is how the state budget kind of.
As we speak, in very round numbers, the university budget at about $1 billion a year, that's of state tax money. Of course,
Right.
the university gets a lot of other money. But from state tax money, the university gets about $1 billion a year, and local government's about $1 billion a year, and those numbers have been virtually unchanged for
Frozen,
quite
right.
a few years now.
Yeah.
And you're let's talk about the university and your service on the Board of Regents. What surprised you? What did you accomplish?
Well, I thought it was a wonderful experience because while all 5 of our sons are graduates of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I served in the legislature for 20 years, it is a different world. And I got to see the world up in Bascom Hill in a much more intimate light, and to sift through their budget and also their unique ways of divvying up responsibilities between the administration and the faculty and the governing structure. And I think it's fairly unique in our country. So it is a very special place. Certainly, I think that it was a wonderful time to serve, and that I got to see the many campuses that we have and the great things throughout the state that the campuses provide for the citizens. It is an awesome, very expensive, but it's an awesome system. And then as part of my service, I got to sit on the Technical College Board. And the Technical College Board is another example of, wouldn't have known much about that. Certainly voted for their budgets and so on, but was not familiar with how expansive it was in our state, and what wonderful facilities there are, and how many young people we serve through it. Not just young people, but our citizens. It's a great system.
There's been, for a very long time, a somewhat adversarial relationship
That's
between
correct.
the legislature and the university. Some would say a love-hate relationship, I suppose. You know, you saw it from the side of the legislature and then the university.
Yes. Well, they don't really understand each other. They could go into psychoanalysis with each other. They don't get it. The legislature, I think, doesn't have perhaps a healthy enough appreciation for the wonderment of it all. I think that the university, on the other hand, simply can't understand who those people are that would deign to judge them and to have an influence on their budgets when they are know-nothings. So it's kind of an odd set of relationships.
Somehow they managed to get along, sort of, but when you entered the legislature, I know the attitude of many legislators is that the university is this huge out-of-control bureaucracy that just does what it wants no matter what the government says or the law says.
And I left the legislature, and that's what they think. I think to this day. But again, you know, speaking with former Speaker Tom Loftus, I think at that point, perhaps in '82, there was at least in leadership, a understanding of the contribution the university made to our communities. And there was, you know, a joy about it, a pride in it, if you will. I think that for a variety of reasons, the legislature doesn't take that pride in it in the same way.
What about the economics? I mean, the UW-Madison brings in so many, what, $500 million
Yes.
in research money. Does the economic argument carry weight?
Theoretically it does, but emotionally it doesn't. Part of, you know, it's just such a different world. I don't know. I think parties have somewhat to do with it. You know, there's a skepticism that the university is skewed to the liberal side. And so Republicans in general, not specifically, but in general, may view it with more antagonism. But even on the other side, on the Democratic side now, I think there's a sense that these are elitists. And while their own particular campus is precious to them, that it's not something that is worthy of some of the other priorities they might have.
That was my next question. There's so many legislative districts have a campus
Right.
in their district, and so many legislators are graduates of one institution.
You bet. You
or
go
the
in
other.
there, or their kids are going to them, or their grandkids.
And yet this antagonism continues.
Doesn't make sense. You kind of wonder, okay.
How could, once again, if you had your druthers, if you could be the mediator or the psychiatrist, if you think that's what they need, how would you go about alleviating this?
Oh, I think more face-to-face time, but that's difficult. You know, like all places, you know, you get people in power for a short period of time. They may make contributions and connections, and then they move on. And the same is true in the legislature. So you make headway for a little bit, 2 steps forward, and then 1 step back.
You've
so
seen
it's hard.
You've seen different university leaders now. We have a chancellor who's only been in a year or so as we speak, and we've changed presidents.
Yes.
Do they and their
Yes, people have
style
different
have a lot
style.
to do with it?
That's right. People have different styles, and certainly speakers have different styles and way of connecting. So I think you see a variation of flux in it. Hopefully, people are more sensitive to each other now.
If you were the university president or the chancellor,
Yeah.
how would you approach it? Spend more time at the Capitol?
Well, I think I would try to build connections, whether it's literally at the Capitol, but through continuing conversations, yes.
In some ways, it's the same problem as medical care. The escalation of costs is greater than inflation for higher education as well as medical care.
That's right.
Why is that, and can or should something be done about that?
Well, I mean, if we look at the population of people that go to the university system now, particularly Madison, we look at a much more wealthy segment of our society. Part of that is the cost. And yet, you look at our salaries by faculty, and they're relatively modest next to, I have a son who is a professor at UCLA, or you know, the University of Rochester, where another son is. So it's very difficult to jive those two things. You don't want to lose your professors, your faculty, and yet you want to bring down the cost. And in this environment, that's very difficult to do, because things are costly.
Some folks say that the main goal of all the campuses, including Madison, should be teaching undergraduates. And not all this research.
I hear that too.
Not all this research stuff, even though the research brings in $500 million. Is it because their kids don't get into Madison? Or what?
Well, I do hear a lot of that. So my granddaughter didn't get into Madison, although she tried from California too. So it's difficult. Yeah, it's very competitive. But the other campuses are wonderful too. And but again, it's costly to go there.
That's the paradox. The other campuses are just fine, as you say.
Oh, they're
and yet
stars.
So many of the kids want to get into Madison.
Yeah.
Reputation, I guess. They don't all belong there, in my opinion.
Well, they don't belong there for a variety of reasons. Not all people, young people particularly, can thrive in an environment which is so large, and they need a smaller environment.
And yet settling for even these other very fine
wonderful
schools seems to be settling for second best. How can you change that?
I don't know. The same thing is occurring in California. So I think, sometimes we get myopic about what goes on in Wisconsin. We don't realize that what we're seeing here is reflected in other places all over the country.
So in California, it's UCLA and Berkeley, and
that's
anything
right.
else is settling for less than the prize, is that?
And yet you go to those campuses and they're knockouts. University of Santa Barbara is gorgeous. And my granddaughter's at Santa Cruz now, and it's just dreamy. So, I don't know.
So no solution on that one in sight either.
No, I don't think so. I have to believe, as I believed when I went into the legislature, that we have to have faith in our democracy and that things are going to come around right, and we just have to keep working toward them.
Now, well, let's get into making things right and talk about lobbying. You've been doing some lobbying lately. For whom?
Well, I've been lobbying for the emergency room physicians, the ophthalmologists, and for the AIDS Resource Center. So 3 groups that I probably would be devoted to no matter what. So.
Are these paid positions?
Yes.
So you're one of those contract lobbyists.
That's right.
Three clients.
Yes, right. And so I work part-time.
So you were lobbied when you were in the legislature. Now you're on the other side.
Right.
And tell us the view from each side.
Well, I think in general, lobbying is kind of an educational thing, so I view it as such. I think I viewed it as that when I was in the legislature. You listen to people and their story, and you accept, reject, counter to their proposals, whatever. Sometimes they can be threatening, and there's only a few personalities or groups that are thus. And I think you have to balance them in your own personal opinion and how your district responds to their issues. And that's a very fine balance for a legislator to achieve.
When you were in the legislature, were you threatened, like we'll find an opponent for you? Or,
surely.
Or on the other hand, you'll get a nice big donation if you vote a certain way?
I don't remember the other thing. I think people did talk about we could be very helpful in that way. That would mean particularly that we will be very positive toward your reelection, and that could mean people are, make sure our troops turn out to
campaign workers or get out the vote.
Yeah, exactly. You always knew that the idea of a contribution could be behind that conversation, but it was not explicit. In terms of though what they could do against you, people were much more verbal.
Mhm. You were threatened with, we'll find an opponent for you?
That's correct. Mostly those people came from the abortion groups and so on.
And
It can be quite mean.
quite mean?
Yeah, mean-spirited and so on.
Well, then, are the people with ideological or philosophical conviction then more difficult to deal with than perhaps economic interests?
I think so. I think so. Because when you think about it, as a legislator, one, as I pointed out, finds a balance between perhaps what you know from information where your constituents are and where the district might need you. So on an economic issue, you would balance those. On a philosophic or a moral issue, let's say the death penalty, let's take that. You really have to be guided by your own particular beliefs. At least I think you do. I think it's pretty cynical not to do that. Now, do people do it? You bet. But I think it's harder for legislators. So to answer your question, is it harder than for people who have strong convictions morally or philosophically to come to some kind of an agreement to modify their position? Harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you believe you have the moral truth, there's no compromise.
That's correct. That's right. I mean, you can't have a little death penalty. You either have to, although people certainly tried. They would say, well, we'll only do it in cases of, or this is a much more painless way to do it, or, you know. Yeah. But, you know, it is what it is.
But with an economic issue,
it's nuanced.
You can say, well, you can argue about the size of the subsidy rather than
That's
absolute
correct.
Yes or no, is that?
That's correct. Or you can say, you know, this may not be good for you out in the rural area, but for me in an urban area, which often is the case where you find a deviation in the way people will vote because they come from urban areas versus rural areas. And urban versus rural, oftentimes, and when I first came to the legislature, was much more vivid, that became more of an issue than Republican versus Democrat, at least in large measure.
I'm thinking of an issue like gun control.
Yes.
A gun means something completely different in Milwaukee than in Fenimore.
You bet. You bet.
So how you know, in
That's right.
rural areas, you know, a kid, usually a boy, gets a .22 rifle at age
That's right.
8, and you know nobody thinks, but a gun is something completely different
in Wauwatosa or in Milwaukee.
So how, once again, reconciling.
That's right.
Very
so
different.
I was very much against, you know, handguns and so on. That was another issue. Just going back to my.
That was used against you.
Yeah, my wicked ways, quote unquote.
It seems as if gun control is pretty much out the window right now, as we speak right now, with
Yeah,
the trends
people
nationally
don't-
and in the state. No gun control advocate apparently in elective office will touch it anymore.
That's right. It's kind of the hot button.
Hot button. Did you, or did you?
Yeah. No, I did. All of the above. I'm guilty. Guilty as charged.
The basic question, I guess, is one which I guess Edmund Burke came up with 200 years ago or more. Do you represent your constituents, or do you be guided by your conscience?
Well, I think where you're
assuming that they're different now.
Yeah,
maybe
I was
they're
just
not,
going to say,
not implying they're always different.
on gun control, in general, my constituents were with me. On abortion, it was not quite as clear. That's probably, 50-50. On other kinds of issues, you probably represent a bit of both. But when I got elected, I think I talked to an old timer about this. I said, when will I know when it's time to go. And he said, you'll know because you won't reflect your community anymore.
You won't reflect it anymore.
That's right. When your beliefs come out of sync with the base of your district. That's difficult to do. So if your base shifts, which it did, by the way, in that 2002 reapportionment, I maybe didn't reflect the center of that district as well. At least I like to reconcile it in my own mind.
Have you had second thoughts about any votes you cast? And think,
Oh yeah, there's one. I'm glad that you asked me that. The lottery.
Oh.
I had this running debate with my husband. He was against it. And I was supportive of it because I said, you know, it's people want to gamble. I would never gamble myself. I'm a poor loser. But why not? And he says, because it's corrupt. And it will grow in corruption. And of course, my side prevailed. His side did not. But I suppose, you know, when I look back on it, that was not probably pretty
So
good.
you voted for the lottery, and that's one you wish you could have back.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Now, at that time, I believe there was no inkling that it would have this effect on the Indian gaming and result in all
No.
these casinos, right? Did anybody see that coming?
Yeah, only one person, and you're going to laugh because he's still serving over there.
Yeah.
Marlon Schneiders
Marlon did?
got up and gave one of those rousing debate speeches at 3 o'clock in the morning. Railed against us.
And he saw that,
Yes.
that this would open the door to Indian
That's
gambling?
right. I'm not sure that he said Indian gaming, but it will open the doors to off-site betting, all kinds of things that we can't even envision at this time.
It may not have been an unintended consequence for some of the proponents, like Ron Paris, who was all for casino gambling and everything right from
Yeah.
the start. But for some, I'm sure it was an unintended consequence
Oh, yeah.
that the federal courts then ruled that if a state offers certain kinds of
It's
gambling, the tribes
then-
must be
that's
allowed
right. And
to do it, and that opened the door for the casinos. Now, that's a huge change in Wisconsin history.
it is.
When I was growing up, Wisconsin was absolutely gambling verboten.
That's correct.
More so
When you
than most other states.
Yeah, there was only 2 states. If you remember on a cereal box, you couldn't enter into some kind of a contest if you lived in Wisconsin and there was another state. And it's because in our Constitution we prohibited lottery, and that was seen as a lottery.
Even if you filled out the little cutout from the
For the
magazine and sent it in for
That's right.
the contest or whatever.
A unique aspect that I had actually forgotten until now. So,
So that's a huge change.
Sea change.
In Wisconsin culture. If you'd have told somebody in 1970 that Wisconsin within 20 years would have casinos, 20
they would have
casinos
thought you
or
were
something.
smoking the drapes.
Oh, yeah, they
Yes.
thought you were really nuts. Another huge change is smoking.
Yes.
You saw much of the change on that.
Yeah. And of course, my husband is a pulmonologist, and
So you needed no convincing.
no, no. And I don't know whether you remember this, but one of the things that I attempted and was never successful, and it showed the power of lobbying groups, was pennies for prevention. And that would put, I think it was 5 cents, 5 pennies on public health spending.
Per pack of cigarettes?
That's right. Pennies for prevention. And I worked on that with Tom Areda from Merrill, Wisconsin. And we worked and worked on that, and just couldn't get it to go anywhere. We thought we were getting it, you know. And the governor said, "Well, if you get it to me, I'll sign it." Well, you'd go up and down the halls toward the end of the budget, and you'd see the lobbyists for the tobacco interests skulking around the corridors. You knew that in the dead of the night, that thing was deader than a doornail.
And yet, since then, the cigarette tax has been vastly increased. Now,
It
is that
has.
simply due to the state's fiscal problems? Is that really what it?
Well, I think maybe that, but also if you remember the Attorney General, had the suit against tobacco.
Sued the tobacco companies.
That's right, along with New York and many other states. Jointly, they prevailed. And the public outcry against tobacco became much more acceptable.
So do legislators, in that case, follow public opinion, or lead it, or just kind of try to walk lockstep with it?
You have to march to a lot of different drummers.
Do you think the legislature on that one was kind of with the public? Certainly, apparently not ahead of the public.
Certainly not ahead
on
of it.
smoking.
No. But, I mean, if you think about Doyle and many other attorneys general at the time, they did lead the way. And I think that suit was pivotal.
Another perennial issue that has not changed much in Wisconsin, drinking.
Oh, yes.
Binge
I
drinking.
really enjoy that
When I read the
debate.
headlines on binge drinking, I look back 40 years and think, might as well have been written 40 years ago, and for that matter, probably 100 years ago.
Yeah.
That one, while smoking and gambling and some of these other things have changed drastically, it seems we're still in the same, now being from, not Milwaukee, Wauwatosa, but nevertheless, supposedly the center of the drinking culture. And, well,
Yes.
maybe rural Wisconsin is too.
I was going to say, I mean,
The whole
having
state.
traveled the state.
The whole state. What could or should be done in that
Yes.
area?
I wouldn't even stick my little toe in that one. I remember so many times we had this discussion about raising the beer tax, because it's really relatively low.
It hasn't been changed since the 60s.
Okay. I mean, people would laugh you out of the caucuses, both caucuses.
And still we haven't, and still that is apparently absolutely off the board.
That's
the
true.
legislature, as we speak right now, has tightened up penalties on drunk driving a little bit.
That's correct.
Nowhere near what the advocates wanted. Is that another example of incrementalism being better than nothing?
It's about all you're going to get in our state. And that's an issue. I'm not quite sure why that one has so much resonance and continues to be vexing to the legislature. It seems to me, after the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel came out with a remarkable series of deaths due to drunk driving, that people would really want to react. It just doesn't seem to resonate in the same way. And maybe, I'm not so sure that this is as much an urban issue, but maybe it's people who find themselves, in rural areas too, that live long way from their gathering spots, and the Tavern League may kind of feed into that, and the fear that they'll be stopped, or they won't be able to party. I honestly don't know what's at the heart of that, but that continues to be. When Roger Bresky was in the legislature, you knew that wasn't going anywhere. For
A Democrat from way up north.
That's
in the
correct.
Senate, who was a tavern owner.
That's right.
So,
But he's been gone for a while, so it still remains the same, and I'm not clearly sure.
we should make clear the stark difference in some ways between rural and Milwaukee and urban. I mean, in Milwaukee, a lot of people can walk to the corner tavern.
Exactly.
Not so much so in rural areas. And
That's
when you
right.
think
You
about
need
the
your
job
car.
of a legislator, the tremendous distances they have to cover, not only to get to Madison, but within their districts,
Right.
some of these gigantic geographical districts, and you could initially pretty much walk yours.
That's correct. And then, of course, as you get a Senate district, even in an urban area, it becomes much more much greater. But, you know, I mean, going up to some of the Sheila Harsdorf's district or you know, Bob Jauk's district, those Senate districts are immense.
They're bigger than many states.
It's exactly, exactly.
Well, to sum it up, do you, looking back on it, your service in the legislature, are you glad you did it? Was it a good experience for you?
Well, it was very rewarding. It was really hard work, and but I guess I came away from it really with a great deal of reverence for it too. It is a wonderful experience, and also the institutions surrounding the Wisconsin State Legislature are particularly praiseworthy. We're sitting at the Legislative Reference Bureau now, and it is truly a nonpartisan place to come. Legislative Council and the Fiscal Bureau have all worked to retain their integrity. And I was familiar, because I was co-chair of it for a while, the audit committee. The auditors have an immense power in Wisconsin, and they're actually under the tutelage or the guidance of the legislature, not the parties. And that is quite unique in the world of legislatures throughout the country, this country. And we ought to be very grateful that we have them and make sure that we continue to keep them.
With today's political culture, would you advise a young person, say one of your sons, who wanted to run for office, would you say, yeah, go do it? Or give them some caveats?
As I said, it's very hard, and also one can't have a very thin skin. And I think it was also very hurtful in part. I ran a couple of elections that I lost, and that is a particularly painful time in one's life. And you have to be resilient, and you have to make sure that your support system, your family, is clearly with you. Otherwise, I think it would be very destabilizing.
But you're glad you did.
Oh, yeah, I am. I was privileged to do it.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank
We'll
you,
probably
John.
keep you on the hot seat any longer. Thank you very much for joining us. I've learned a lot here. We've been talking with Peggy Rosenzweig, who was both a member of the Assembly and a member of the Senate as a Republican from Wauwatosa. Thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you, John. It was a privilege to be here.